Okay. Okay, good evening, and thank you for coming. The Torah reading this week is the Parsha of Korach. The chapters that it covers, I didn't write them down exactly, but it's in the book of Numbers, and I know it encompasses chapter 17. And Korach presents us with the classical definition of a machloket, of a dispute. And I think each of us, or any of us who have been part of a community, especially any Jewish community, is probably well aware that disputes take place. We should also be aware that there are times when there are no disputes. It's probably harder to think of those type of times than the times when there are disputes going on. So the title of tonight's class is Nature's Most Fragile Habitat, the Jewish Community. Now, the reason the word habitat is being used is because we want to ground this class in the viewpoint that community is a habitat. It's a place that's meant to grow and develop and foster and enable everyone who's part of the community to flourish. So that's what I think of when I think of as a habitat. There's people like being in their habitat. When we go to the zoo in San Diego, they take great pride in recreating the proper habitat for each of the animals who are fortunate enough to live there or not fortunate enough to live there, because it gives them a sense that they belong and they have a place there. And I just want to remind everybody tonight that the theme of the book of Bamidbar, which means in the wilderness, is this attempt at actualizing the goals of the Torah. What does that mean? The Jewish people came out of Egypt. We received the Torah at Sinai. We built the tabernacle. And then we were charged with the opportunity and responsibility to try to live together in the wilderness and live up to the standards and the aspirations and the mitzvot, the rules of the Torah. That's what that goal was. How long it was supposed to last for? Originally not for very long. It ends up lasting for 40 years, as we learned in last week's Torah reading. But that's the sense of it being a habitat, a laboratory, a place where we, the Jewish people, could establish ourselves as a united group of people, a connected group of people, a community of people, living within the framework of the Torah. And that's what I physically see when you see a representation of the Jewish people spread out in a wilderness. It means there's no other cities, there's no other cultures, it's a pristine environment, sort of like a laboratory would be, where you eliminate a lot of distractions. And then you say, okay, we're going to see how this group develops, coalesces, works it out, lives within this habitat, and let's see what the outcomes are going to be. So that's the view, that's the idyllic view. And of course, we know that in the course of every idyllic view, there's disruptions and things that shake things up. So I want to begin with this idea of the source number one. I didn't number the sources here because I had a hard time with the sheet, but if you look at the end of the Torah, Deuteronomy 29:9, you find Moshe on the very last day of his life saying something very significant. Moshe, in his farewell speech to the Jewish people, starts by saying, Atem nitzavim hayom kulchem lifnei Hashem Elokeichem. You are standing this day before the Lord your God, the leaders of the tribes, your elders, your officers, every member of the Jewish people. That's what Moshe says. Is he saying anything of any significance here? Yes. So Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch in his commentary says that this final speech of Moshe comes after a charge of admonition and a prophecy of hardship that could befall the Jewish people. And in fact, we know that we, the Jewish people, have a very blood-stained history. So what Moshe is trying to convey to the Jewish people, according to Rav Hirsch, is you will outlast all of the punishments and challenges. In fact, it is the suffering the challenges, the difficulties that will sustain you. So this is a profound thought about Jewish community life, okay? We're used to going to communities in Europe and saying once upon a time there was a Jewish community here and it has been destroyed. That's true, but we also like to understand that remnants of that community have been sustained elsewhere to some extent in the world. So there's a sense of community. There's a sense that any moment in history when the Jewish people connected in a place has created something permanent in the world, and it lasts and endures against everything. And the key word there for people who know Hebrew well is the word nitzavim, because it properly should say atem omdim hayom, we're standing here. Nitzavim comes from the word matzeva, a tombstone, a stone, an erected monument. And therefore Moshe is conveying the sense, look at us today, we're all here. Now there's tremendous irony in Moshe saying that, because after all, the entire nation that came out of Egypt over the age of 20 dies in the wilderness. So, there's a sense of amazement that Moshe would articulate this on the last day of his life, when in fact, every single adult he's speaking to is an orphan, having lost their own parents in the course of the wilderness. However, Moshe is making a point. And that point is that to the extent that we form community and the extent that we can sustain community, we are eternal. And that's the concept that Moshe is laying down here. So I want to start with that idea, because we're talking about the Jewish community being a fragile habitat, which it is. But Moses, the leader of the teacher of the Jewish people on the last day of his life, says, yes, it needs to be respected, it needs to be guarded, it needs to be watched over, it needs to be protected. But please understand, says Moshe, that it is eternal. It will withstand whatever comes its way. And I just wanted to, this is a secular source, which I just wanted to add here because it's meaningful to me. Paul Johnson, who wrote a book about the Jewish people, he has two quotes from him here, and I associate them with this. Number one, Judaism has managed it better than any other culture known to me, the delicate balance between individual responsibility and social responsibility. Meaning, in my view, and I think he means this as well, that as much as community plays a huge role, individual greatness and achievement also plays a role. So the Jewish people didn't see communal life as do I devalue my sense as an individual, and that's the price of forging community, which of course to some extent has to take place, or do I live my life as this blazing individual, the cowboy or Daniel Boone living out in Kentucky, where as soon as he saw the smoke from the nearest chimney, he moved further west? Or do I see myself as balancing both? And Paul Johnson commends the Jewish people for being able to balance both. And we know we live at a time, Rabbi Sachs often said, we live at a time of the me generation. People have used those type of words, which probably means that to an important extent, we're not doing the best job right now as a society of balancing the sense of being part of a community with social responsibility, yet having individual responsibility. And in some ways, and I'm not here to discuss politics, but this concept of equity, to some extent, is almost like an attempt to wash over any sense of individuality. If our only goal is to level the playing field and so that everybody lives the same, then where does individuality express itself? That's a comment we'll put on the side. The next thing he says, Jewish life is about the cultivation of virtue. It takes a community to sustain the life of virtue, a life of virtue. This I believe in very, very much. And I'll just make a reference here, which didn't fit on the page, but it's an important one here. This week's Torah reading begins with the word Vayikach Korach, and Korach took, to take. The Torah never says what he took. Rashi's troubled by this. Rashi's a very serious reader of the Torah. And the only answer Rashi can come up with is Korach took himself, meaning he literally took himself and he separated himself from the community. We understand, and we're not going to go into the details of this right now. He felt overlooked. He felt as though he wasn't being valued. He felt as though he belonged as the leader or a leader or in a much more important place, something that certainly all of us have probably experienced every now and then. Certainly all of us who have siblings feel that way every once in a while. But so that's a key here. The sense that it takes a community to sustain a life of virtue. What Rashi makes clear at the outset of this week's Torah reading is that it takes separating from the community to sustain rebellion and undermining and a life which is ultimately meant to stand in opposition to the direction that society is taking. So that's a key. I think we see that in modern history all the time. The great leaders, and I use that word very loosely here, but that have emerged have tended to be loners. You know, the people whose ideas have often influenced the world have been people who live very apart from everybody else, even apart from their own families in a lot of ways. So that's a word of caution. So we have this model now that community is good, individuality is good, and that we hold the possibility that within this fragile habitat of Jewish community, our achievement is, according to Paul Johnson, that we can sustain both at the same time. Let's see a little bit what that, and if there's any questions, if you raise your hand, or if you, I wish I could see the chat. When I share the page, I lose a lot of the vantage points I have, but if anybody raises their hand, or if you want to unmute yourself, and instead of having your dog bark, say something, we'll be happy to address whatever questions you have. The next source comes from the Talmud in Sanhedrin 110a, which we're going to refer to at least twice tonight in terms of its analysis of what takes place. There are parts of the narrative I'll just gloss over very quickly, but basically Korach launches a rebellion. He, together with two other prominent Jewish people and 250 elders from the tribe of Reuven, stand up and accuse Moshe and Aaron of taking for themselves the reins of leadership in a way that is not in consonance with God's plan. And they put this in a very idealistic way. And the idealistic way is, like people do often, aren't we all holy people? Why would God think to have two brothers at the helm of leadership of such a great community of people as we are? Do you think God would really do that and make us all second-class citizens? So you see the rhetoric, the approach, all this is written into the Torah. Moshe, uncharacteristically, and we discussed this in a class a couple of years ago, we're not going to go into it now, but Moshe basically prays on behalf of the Jewish people because God gets very angry with the Jewish people. But then Moshe turns to God and uncharacteristically says, look, God, if this man Korach and his supporters die an ordinary death, then I'm giving up my leadership to the Jewish people right now. And God seems to agree with that assessment, and hence we have Korach dying in the most unusual way. The earth swallows him up, something not recorded anyplace else in the Torah. And in fact, in Pirkei Avot, in Ethics of the Father, it states that the very mouth of the earth that swallowed up Korach was created at the time of creation because it was a unusual phenomenon, as what we say in Hebrew, chad pa'ami, something that had one moment of activity, and therefore God set it up that way. But let's look at something else, what the Talmud says about Moshe under these harsh conditions. The Talmud quotes Numbers 16:25, and Moshe arose and went to Datan and Aviram. Those are two of the leaders who joined Korach, two primary leaders with Korach. Reish Lakish, a Talmudic sage, says, from here we derive that one may not perpetuate a dispute as Rav said, and Reish Lakish is quoting Rav, a higher authority than himself, an earlier authority, anyone who perpetuates a dispute violates a prohibition, as it's stated, and he quotes something from this week's Torah reading, and he will not be like Korach and his assembly. We are prohibited, according to this view, from acting in the manner that Korach is. Is it a mitzvah, one of the 613 commandments? We'll look at a view of that later. Generally not. But in other words, this is the way he lays it out. But then he goes on to say, even the aggrieved party must seek to end the dispute. Datan and Aviram accused Moshe, and by right, they should have initiated the reconciliation. Nevertheless, Moshe was not insistent on this. He went to them in order to attempt to solve the dispute. So again, we get a very nuanced, complex picture of Moshe here. The same Moshe who turns to God and says, these people cannot die an ordinary death, because if that were to happen, it will leave a question mark over the whole validity and veracity of the Torah. That's how serious this challenge was. Moshe, according to them, was making it up. Moshe said, "Oh, wouldn't it be cool to be the leader, and have full access to all the wealth? And wouldn't it be cool if my brother was the high priest and the Kohen Gadol? Wow, what a family we would be. We'll rule forever, or for as long as we can." That was the accusation that Korach put forward, and Moshe saw it as a fundamental, basic challenge to the continuity of the Jewish people and the sustaining of the Torah as given at Mount Sinai. But the same Moshe who understood all that was perfectly ready to run to the homes of Dathan and Aviram and try and attempt to reconcile himself with them and to talk them down from the position that they had taken. So what do we see here in the Talmud? We see something very astounding about a person's responsibility to see the community as a fragile habitat, to use the phrase I'm using, and to recognize, even though I am 100% right, and even though they are dead wrong, with an emphasis on the word dead there, it's still within my responsibility to go after them, to seek reconciliation, to see if there's anything I can do. And in fact, later in the narrative, it's not mentioned in the Talmud here, but later in the narrative, God has to tell Moshe, I'm about to have the earth swallow these guys up. You better get out of the way, or else you're going to be accidentally, inadvertently swallowed up with them. Like, Moshe is so intent on reaching a point of reconciliation and sustaining the community and not having even this historic fragmentation take place, but rather see it as something that could possibly be reconciled, that Moshe is risking his life, risking his dignity, risking even the clarity of his own standing in the Jewish people. Because after all, you can just see the New York Times reporter sitting on the sideline and writing the column, well, if Moshe thought he was so right, what is he doing running after these guys and pleading with them? Why didn't he just stand his ground and let things fall as they may? Perhaps Moshe has his own doubts, which is not the case. But Moshe, understanding all that, understood the possibility of what the editorial in the paper the next morning might look like, felt it incumbent upon himself to demonstrate the primacy of community, to demonstrate that when Korach set an example of separating from the community, he needed to affirm to the ultimate degree the value of community, and an attempt that community can only exist when there's a serious effort at reconciling disputes and keeping a connection between people going. Okay. And please understand, just in terms of the sources we've looked at already, This is the same Moshe who years later is going to announce to everybody, look, we're all here. Here we are. Atem nitzavim hayam. We made it through 40 years in the wilderness. We're on the verge of going into the land of Israel. Look around. We're here. We made it. We're always going to make it. Moshe, there's no contradiction in his view because the community makes it. And as the leader of the community, Moshe was clear that anything that could possibly help sustain, nurture, deepen, or strengthen the community, he was absolutely ready to do. And that's what Reish Lakish is pointing out here and illustrating for us in the name of Rav, a fantastic lesson in terms of how we should regard the fragile habitat of a Jewish community. I just added another source here, which is the writing of the Chafetz Chaim, the leader of European Jewry who passed away in 1933, wrote in his seminal book about the laws of speech, if a person nurtures a quarrel in his speaking, he transgresses and he shall not be as Korach and as his congregation, which is an exhortation against nurturing a quarrel. He doesn't go on to say, even if you're in the right and the other person's in the wrong, but he refers to that Talmudic passage we just looked at. So it's very clear what the Chafetz Chaim is saying. Purity of speech, which the Chafetz Chaim, Rabbi Yisrael Meir HaKohen, saw as the wedge issue in undermining community, the way we speak about one another and the way we speak to one another, points this out and considers that he transgresses something. Now, again, like I say, in a technical sense, and we're going to look at something very interesting here, a source that I didn't know about until 2 days ago, that does it fit into the 613 mitzvot or not? It doesn't seem to, because this sentence 17:5, not to be like Korach and his congregation, seems like it's much more part of the narrative. So then you come across this next source, which is shocking and surprising and was unknown to me. If you look in Leviticus, chapter 19, which right away is the chapter that has to do with the holiness of the Jewish people, just a few verses away from the famous quote of love your neighbor as yourself. You have the sentence, you shall not oppress your fellow, you shall not rob him. Oppression oftentimes refers to the way we speak about others. Robbing a person, everyone understands what a disruption of society it is. If I break down your front door and take what I want out of your house, which is what robbery is, in the most naked sense, it's not cheating someone. The word gezeilah in Hebrew is to steal in front of the face of the person. You can't have a society. There's no such thing as a community. I have to have my gun and you'll have to have your gun and you'll have your guards and I'll have my guards. And every time I walk out of my house, I have to set my alarm system for 3 hours and call the company and make sure everything is being watched over carefully. If that's the world I live in, it's the same way that corruption undermines a society, so does gezeilah. So look what the smag, which is Sefer Mitzvot Gedolah, who counts the mitzvot, writes, included in this prohibition is what Rav stated. Anyone who perpetuates a dispute violates a prohibition, be not like Korach and his assemblies. I would challenge everybody on this class tonight. What is the smag, the person, the author of this book, thinking to include this prohibition under the law, the clear statement of you shall not be a robber? Anyone want to make a suggestion? Please feel free to unmute yourself and lay it on us.
Because you've got to come to some resolution. You can't always, something's got to come to, you have to find peace and get people to connect. And if you let this thing continue, it's going to fester and cause more violation and more disputes if you don't come to resolution.
Yeah, and it undermines a sense of community to the same extent of me being an armed robber. It has equal impact on the society. That's the audacious connection that the Sefer Mitzvos Gedolah is making. And he literally counts this violation. It's an unusual opinion. There happens to be some discussion that Maimonides for sure does not, because Maimonides refers to this as a reference, but not an actual connection. But the Ramban Nachmanides is a question and something he writes, whether he really counts it amongst the 613 commandments. And that's what the Chafetz Chaim was jumping on. We think, I see, I don't speak so well. I'm not so respectful. I'm a little loosey-goosey in terms of the way I refer to my friends, my teachers, my rabbi. After all, on a Shabbos afternoon, what better activity can anybody have but to make fun of what the rabbi had to say in the morning, or whatever, however dynamic people live their lives. What this author is putting in front of us is saying, would you go on Shabbos afternoon with a gun and knock on your neighbor's house and say, your cholent smells really good, I'm taking it from you and I'm eating it and I'll bring back the pot after I'm done? No, you wouldn't do that, because you see that as so antisocial and antithetical to what Shabbos is all about. When you use your speech to perpetuate a dispute, it's a specific type of negative speech. When I make sure every Shabbos guest understands that I think this person has cheated me in business and it's unforgivable and nobody should ever trust him again, whatever the particular situation is. What did I do here? That's going to have this type of an effect. 1 second. Different. Can anybody still see the split screen, or you can't either? Does your screen still look the same?
Yeah.
Yep.
You still see the sources there?
Yes.
Oh, great. I'm the only one who can't now. Okay, good. I have to apologize that I have to use my source sheet because I touched something here in my Google.
If you check like the top corner, top right, maybe you hit edit.
No. I'm digging a hole here for myself as I'm trying to do differently. If you can see the sources, I'm okay. Because and you can see each other and stuff like that. Let me just try one thing here. Okay. All right, if you're good, I'm good. Okay. I'll trust that you're still there. If somebody just says something, then I'll feel a little bit better. Is everybody still there?
Good.
Yes. We're all
Okay,
there.
good. Okay, good. Next source. Given what we've just said, how do we look upon disputes altogether? That's the question I wanted to raise. How do we even look upon the idea of disputes? Do we come to the conclusion that disputes are verboten and they're off limits and there should never be a dispute that takes place, or not? Please offer an opinion, especially since I'm sitting here in the dark with my source sheet. But more you,
No, if it's for the sake of heaven, as they say, then it's perfectly okay to have a dispute. If it's to aggrandize yourself, probably not.
okay, great. So that's why this next source is up here, because you might think that what we've talked about is that if, to the extent that a community is a fragile, sensitive habitat, and it requires us to protect it, and to the extent to which perpetuating a dispute would be the equivalent of robbing your neighbor, then why don't we just say disputes are off limit? Why don't we say that when my wife asks me, do you want the cauliflower or do you want the green beans? And I say the cauliflower, and she says the green beans are a better choice, and we argue about that we're not destroying society. So that brings us to Pirkei Avot, chapter 5, sentence 17. Every dispute that is for the sake of heaven will endure. And enduring, we're going to see what that means according to different, at least one opinion. but enduring is a good thing. Because remember, we started off this class by highlighting the fact that according to Moshe, there's an immense amount of strength in a Jewish community because Atem Nitzavim Hayom, we've endured and we will always endure. So enduring is a good thing. Pirkei Avot continues, but if it's not for the sake of heaven, it would not endure. It continues very explicitly. What is an example of a dispute for the sake of heaven? The argument of Hillel and Shammai. What is an example of a dispute not for the sake of heaven? Bingo, the dispute of Korach and his congregation. We get our week's parsha. Okay, so what we're seeing here is that the rabbis in Pirkei Avot are not anti-machloket. So what we have to do is go back to these sources and say, let's read the Talmud a little bit more carefully. It says what they're talking about is a person who, Rav says, anyone who perpetuates a dispute violates a prohibition. Now, that's where I wanted to get linguistically a little bit clear here. What is the difference between perpetuating a dispute and saying it's a great thing to have a dispute for the sake of heaven because it's going to endure forever? Doesn't that perpetuate the dispute? So Selwyn was pointing out a difference. What's your motivation? Is your motivation that the pot should be boiling and there should be a sense of tension in the world, or that everyone should know that I'm right and the other guy's a moron and he's wrong? Or is my sense that his view has something important to it, my view has something important to it? It would be a good thing for people to consider both forever. And what's really interesting about the view of the Torah and the Jewish people is that that's a good thing, that even though we're in the end going to decide that the opinion of Hillel carries almost always, and the opinion of Shammai almost always doesn't carry, even though we're going to decide that, we're still going to record the dispute and keep it alive, because there's value in considering in a fair-minded way, for the sake of heaven, both viewpoints. Let's see what the next source says to explain this. Next source, and I hope you can see me here. An argument which is for the sake of heaven, its purpose is to arrive at the truth, and this endures. As it says, and I don't know where this quote is from a dispute, the truth will emerge. This is like the argument between Hillel and Shammai. This is a commentary on the Mishnah by Rav Bartanura. And both endure. Both endure, meaning both opinions remain important, even though only one opinion is going to be given validity as far as determining how we act and what the law is. Goes on, and the argument which is not for the sake of heaven, its desired purpose is to achieve power. And when he says, and the love of victory, meaning it's not that its purpose is the love of victory, but it's sustained through a person's love for victory. And its end will not endure. As we found in the argument of Korach and his congregation, that their aim and ultimate intent was to achieve honor and power. And then he throws in the kicker, and they did not endure. Now, there's a little irony here. We're still talking about them, so they endure. And there's actually an interesting Talmudic passage which addresses that idea. Because the Talmud elsewhere has a very esoteric idea that a certain rabbi would go once a year to the very place where the ground swallowed up Korach, and he would put his ear to the ground, and he would hear the voice of Korach saying, Moshe emet, v'Torato emet. He would hear Korach's own voice, even though Korach himself didn't endure, but affirming and validating the sense that what Moshe taught us, the Torah that he taught us, is true. So Korach himself becomes part of enduring, but in a negative way, not in the way that we would love to see our children endure and having the stature of a Hillel or a Shammai, but it endures in the negative counterpoint of being the person who shows us that that there's foreboding and destruction possible through machloket. And I just wanted to end with a thought which goes as follows. The word machloket, and that's the Hebrew here, shoret hamilah machloket hi chelek. So if you look at the Hebrew, the word machloket, which means a dispute, has in the word in the middle chelek. Now, I'm not 100% sure that this is valid because there's a word Hebrew chalak, and there's other related words which mean smooth. So I'm on a little bit of thin ice here, but I wanted to put this idea out there. A machloket by definition means that if you and I are having a dispute, look, I could be a totally evil person. I could make something up which is totally not true, in which case I don't even think it reaches the point of machloket. It's just like evil. But a machloket exists because I see something, I see a portion of the totality of something, and I believe that I'm right. I believe you owe me $1,000 based on the dealings that we had. You look at the same circumstances and the same events, you're seeing a different portion of it, and therefore you come to the conclusion, no, Weiser owes me the money. What is he talking about? I owe him $1,000. He owes me $1,000, and hence we have a dispute. To the extent that we can understand that we are seeing fragments of a whole, and to the extent that we could make an attempt by talking to each other constructively, we could make an attempt to feel as though perhaps if we talk it out, I can explain my portion, my chelek, my section of reality that I'm seeing. And you can listen to me and hear me out. And then I'll do the same for you and hear your portion, your piece of the puzzle that you're seeing. And then maybe we could fit the pieces of the puzzle together somehow, and we could come up with a unified view. Now, what we should understand is the following. If we don't do this at all, we also don't have a community. If you and I don't communicate with one another, if you and I never seek, if I say to you, good morning, today's Tuesday, and you say, good morning, today's Wednesday, and I say, humph, and you say, humph, and I turn my back on you and you turn your back on me and we walk away, we also don't have a community. We also don't have any sense of nurturing virtue. We become totally fragmented, even to the extent that there's not even any machloket. We don't, if somebody says, who's your neighbor? I don't even know his name. Not so unusual in California. What do you know about him? Well, I know what car he drives. I see him probably 5 times a week. He gets into his car, I get into my car. He seems to go north, I go south. He looks like a decent fellow. He hasn't made too much noise lately. We're getting along fine. It's easy to say that. That's not a community either. So to the extent that if I say, good morning, have a great Tuesday, and you look at me and say, you're out of your cotton picking mind, today's Wednesday, and I say to you, well, tell me, why do you think today is Wednesday? And you explain to me why you do, and maybe it's because your business is based in Brussels and it's Wednesday there, and you're already up to date and your computer's been updated, and as far as you're concerned, today is Wednesday, June 9th. And I say, oh, that's interesting, because my business is in Hawaii, and I've got 4 more hours of Tuesday left than you do, than everybody else does here. Then we could begin to see your perspective, my perspective, we could fit it together. And then we could become a habitat that could nurture and sustain virtue to use the words of Paul Johnson, then we would not each be living side by side, each of us thinking, to quote an old song, if only I ruled the world, everything would be so much better. But that's also not a community. That's not an incubator for virtue. That's not a way of fulfilling the goals of the Torah. It's not a way to live up to the standard of Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Vazeh. Everyone's connected to one another. So what I wanted to get across tonight in these few minutes with some of these sources, and I wrote it at the end here, with avoidance of all dispute comes disconnection. Dispute can create connection and harmony when its purpose and its goal is to refine thinking and to see how the pieces fit into the puzzle. And this idea of the pieces comes from the word machloket. I have my piece of reality, you have your piece of reality. And in a class a long time ago, I mentioned the idea that a very brilliant thinker, a woman named Tzipora Heller, her definition of truth is the fullness of what's there. So that, which is beyond what any human being can ultimately see. We have our narrow, subjective opportunity to look out at the world. So for us to say, that's why it says in the prophets that God's world is way beyond our world. And that's part of the idea of having faith in God and trust in God. And feeling as though I'm willing to sacrifice to be part of a community, because who am I kidding anyway? I might have a decent portion, chelek, of intelligence and education and sincerity and love for my fellow man and all these other great ideas that I hold up and affirm, but I'm still not God. So that if I take the Torah and I say that's going to be the umbrella of our society, that's going to set out the parameters of our society, and I'm going to seek vigorously to live within that, to reconcile disputes in a healthy, normative way, and not to avoid them at all costs, then I can be a player and a builder of community, and I can ultimately look at my life and say, Atem nitzavim hayam kulchem, we're all here. Hillel and Shammai are really here in a profound way. Korach, in I forget the right word, in inverse of himself, is also here. Because he gave us the pause and the warning to think long and hard about whether to have the cauliflower or the green beans, whether to listen to what your wife prefers or not. And that's where this idea, this sense of achieving an eternal value of life, which is what the Torah's ultimate goal is for every human being, requires us to think about the fragile habitat the Jewish community is and how we can do our part to build it, uphold it, and preserve it. Any questions?
I have a question, Rabbi. One of the things that we experience every 4 years here is a divided community based on politics, but really based on different values. Such that, let's just say, on a value of liberty, one group might say, well, that's individual personal freedom. And another group might say, well, liberty means equality, right? And that divides our community. I'm just using an example there, but there are many, elements that you can look at certain values from, in politics, they talk about left and right, but I mean, just different views of the world.
Right.
How do you explain that, and how does this context address the issues of just basic values?
Right. So I'll tell you an approach that works, even though it's probably not of the highest order. And that's this. I'll start with something. Something that Rav Nebenzahl, a rabbi from the Old City, taught me. He said, why do we mourn the loss of a Torah scholar? And he says, we mourn the loss of the Torah scholar because never before and never again will there be exactly that understanding of God's Torah. Now that's a perplexing idea. When I was a young student and I heard him say this idea, it really troubled me because after all, Torah, that's what unites the Jewish people. God stood at Sinai and said, gave us the principles of life. I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. But somehow, each and every one of us, with all sincerity, and it's not a question of, whether I'm going to join the coalition against Netanyahu or for Netanyahu. We're not talking about any religious issues like that. Each of us has a vantage point and a perspective which is ultimately going to be unique. Now you can celebrate that in a good way and say, I'm really happy that Shammai lives down the street from me if you're Hillel, because Shammai's thinking about the Torah is so radically different. It happens not to be true, by the way. Shammai and Hillel disagreed on very little, but it was the students of Shammai and the students of Hillel that disagreed on much more. But in other words, if I'm a student of Hillel and I see the guy across the street from me who's a student of Shammai, and I think to myself, that poor schmo, he had the wrong teacher. He's got it all wrong. If I see him that way, then we're going to morph into two different camps and two different religions and two different, political parties. And we're just going to end up, like you say, in an idealistic way, arguing about everything. But if instead I say, thankfully, there's a student of Shammai down the block who I can sit down with, I can explain my viewpoint, and he's going to say, that's ridiculous, Weiser. I don't know who, you must have been sleeping when your teacher was teaching you these sentences because you got it all wrong. But he wouldn't say it that way. He would say it very respectfully. And he would say, let me explain to you my viewpoint. So to the extent that we muster a high level of saying we can learn from each other. Now, the rubber really hits the road when I think to myself, the only reason you feel that way is because you really are an anti-Semite, because you really are a totally selfish person, and that's why you don't get the idea that I'm right here and you're wrong. But that's where this quote from the Talmud and Sanhedrin jumps out and is so radicalizing. Moshe, and I played out with the idea of the editorial in the New York Times, Moshe had no doubt in his mind that Dasan and Aviram were motivated by base desires of self-aggrandizement and pursuit of power and disrupting the harmony of the Jewish people. He was sure of that. Yet he sought reconciliation, not reconciliation by saying you're right and I'm wrong, because that would have caused a tremendous disruption to the integrity of the Jewish people forever. But I'm seeking reconciliation because I have this sense of community that I want us to fit together. I want us to find a way of coexisting. And to some extent, Selwyn, maybe by not being as engaged with each other, if you and I really don't see eye to eye about the importance of a football team in San Diego, so I'm going to let you sit on the commission and I'm going to pass on that one, and I'm willing to go along. If we spend $2 billion of government money to keep them here, I'm okay. And if we don't, I'm going to be okay, even though I feel passionately we should or we shouldn't or whatever the deal is. But in the name of community, I'm willing to do that. Now, Moshe was not willing to let Dasan V'Aviram just say, just continue living here. I believe in free speech, and for the next 50 years, you're going to undermine everything I say and teach, and Aaron is going to teach. That wasn't his idea. But he did have a way of appealing to them, not saying you're a selfish, power-hungry, disruptive person and your life is in danger, but rather saying, look, Dasan V'Aviram, let's try to find a place for you within the Jewish people. I would imagine that you can make a difference, you can feel comfortable, you can live a dignified life. Don't jump into the hole you're digging for yourself and create such a tragedy for your own life and such a disruption in the community, because I, Moshe, in spite of everything, believe you have a place and you belong to the Jewish people. And let's find that place for you where you could also make some positive contribution. I'm imagining this. I'm not 100% sure, but I think that's a framework for us to at least dig our way out of some of the holes that we're digging all the time.
So in a sense, it's how you argue.
And having it, just what we said here, and having a determination that even if ultimately this is going to be a sense of tension and dispute, and I don't mean in the sense of Hillel and Shammai, but like really, it'll be a personal grievance. Let's find a way to minimize the disruption and to coexist on as peaceful level as possible. But I recognize the fact that that's not really community. Those are me and my neighbor in California that don't talk to each other. We don't argue about politics because we don't talk to each other. That's not community. But to some extent, if that's the best we can do to live next door to each other peacefully, then that's what we have to do. So there has to be that framework. That's a commitment to community, to everybody belonging. We, unlike Moshe's heroic effort there, we're not so convinced that everybody, we would, if we saw the ground opening up under some of our neighbors, we probably wouldn't run to save them. Moshe would, but he would do so hoping that ultimately we could work everything out.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
All right, thank you for joining. Everybody should have a great week, and hopefully we should all take this to heart and do our part to build up Jewish life and Jewish community. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Week,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.